Hi, welcome to the chapter on money growth and inflation. There are various types of inflation that I want to first of all start with in this chapter. First of all, inflation is an overall increase in the level of prices in the economy. So it's where all prices in the economy go up. Now, of course, they'll go up at different rates, but that's not the point. Remember, when we're measuring inflation for the macroeconomy, we take an average of those prices, and hence we usually use the CPI for that, if we're measuring consumer inflation at least. Now, we can have periods when prices actually decrease rather than increase, and we call that deflation. And Japan is a country that's had deflation recently, and still has, in fact, I believe. Hyperinflation is where we have extraordinarily high rates of inflation, and we're going to talk about that as well. Disinflation is where you have rising prices, but the rate of increase in those prices is decreasing. So it's like a deceleration in the rate of increase. So, for instance, if the rate of inflation fell from 10% to 5% to 3%, that would be disinflation. Now, to explain inflation in economics, we use something called the classical theory of inflation. It comes from a group of economists called the classical economists who were around at the end of the previous century, so the end of the 19th century, through until the rise of Keynes in the 1930s, around the time of the Great Depression. And the central feature of the classical theory of money is the so-called quantity theory. It explains the long-run determinants of the price level. So what really determines why prices go up, and if we can explain why prices go up, of course, then we can explain the inflation rate. So that's really what we're going to be doing for most of this chapter. And I've already mentioned that inflation is an economy-wide phenomenon, and it concerns the value of the economy's medium of exchange. It concerns the value of money. If we have inflation, then it means every dollar can buy less goods and services. So it lowers the value of every dollar. And that's what it says there as well. Now remember that the real value of the money supply is measured as M, the amount of money in the economy, or some measure of money supply, say M1 or M2, divided by the price level. And that's usually taken to be the consumer price index. So we measure the real value of money by M over P. So you can see if P is rising and M is constant even, then the real value of the money supply must be decreasing. What it means is that every dollar that's been issued can buy less goods and services, so the amount of dollars that have been issued can buy in the economy as a whole less goods and services. Now when we look at the classical theory of inflation, classical theory of money, we actually take what we did in microeconomics, demand and supply in other words, and we adapt that for use as a tool for analyzing money. So you can think of this as money demand and money supply. So with money demand, really it reflects how much wealth people want to hold in a very liquid form, in other words as currency usually. It depends on our definition of money, of course, but if we're using M1, for example, it would be how much people want to hold as currency, in other words, notes and coins, or in their checking accounts, transactions, deposits, in other words. It depends on things like, the usage of credit cards. The more credit cards we use, of course, the less we're going to need money. The availability of ATM machines, the more available they are, the more money we're probably likely the less money, we're likely to hold. Why? Because we can always go very conveniently to an ATM. If there are very few ATMs, it means that probably we're going to hold more money because we're not sure when the next time is we're going to come across an ATM machine. Depends on the interest rate as well. Why? Because other assets, remember money is an asset here, other assets like bonds and even stocks, high interest checking accounts, savings accounts, CDs, they all give you interest. They all give you an income. So the higher is that income, the more likely you are to lower the amount of money you hold. In other words, the interest rate is the opportunity cost of holding money. And the average level of prices in the economy. Obviously, if there's a high level of prices, then we're going to hold more money to just fund our everyday purchases. And like any demand curve, the demand curve for money is going to be downward sloping. With what? Well, with the interest rate. The interest rate is like a price of money, but it isn't a price, of course. It's the opportunity cost of holding money. So this is a slightly different interpretation from the kind of demand and supply diagrams that we've seen before. Now, money supply, so we've done demand, supply, it's very easy. It's determined by the Fed and the banking system. And we're going to assume that the money multiplier is fixed. So the amount of money in the economy is fixed basically by the Fed. So let's assume that the supply curve is vertical here. In other words, it doesn't depend on the interest rate. Now, the result of putting money demand and money supply together on one diagram is that in the long run, the overall level of prices is going to adjust to the level at which demand for money equals the supply of money. So if we wanted to draw this as a graph, here you have the value of money, and you have on the vertical axis, and you have the money supply as well there on the money demand. Notice here that instead of using the interest rate on the vertical axis, which is not what you normally do with supply and demand, what he's doing is looking at the price level here. And it's the same idea. So in other words, for a low price level, we're not going to hold too much money. For a high price level, it means that the value of money is low, so we're going to hold more money, or want to hold more money. So let's say in equilibrium the Fed doubles the supply of money, prints bills, drops them on the market. Maybe you can imagine that might be Ben Bernanke throwing dollar bills out of a helicopter. That's the way a lot of economists see it, in fact. Or the Fed does an open market purchase, of course. Purchase of what? Government bonds. That obviously increases the money supply through the banking system. What will the new equilibrium be? Well, the supply curve is going to shift to the right. That means the value of money decreases, and that means the price level increases. So let's show this in a diagram. Here we're going to see money supply shifting to the right. That's an increase in the money supply. Because there's more money chasing the same amount of goods, that pushes up prices in the economy. So you can see the arrow on the right. I'll start with 3, increasing the price level. But at the same time, moving to that point means that the value of money, 1 over P, is falling. So that's number 2. And so that's the result. You get a lower value of money. There's more money in the economy, though. Why is that? That's because of inflation, of course. And it's the inflation that's caused by the Fed basically increasing the money supply in the economy. So now we move on to the kind of more specialized part of the quantity theory of money. Here, what we've already determined is that the quantity of money in the economy determines the price level. And if the quantity of money determines the price level, then we can take percent changes of that and say the growth rate in the quantity of money determines the percent change in prices. Well, what's the percent change in prices? Well, it's inflation. Ceteris paribus, as long as nothing else changes. And obviously there's going to be an adjustment process here. First of all, there's going to be an excess supply of money. It's going to increase the demand for goods and services, but the amount of goods and services we're going to assume is pretty constant. That means the prices of all the goods and services, because the demand for them is going up, the prices of all of them will go up. That'll increase the price of each good or service, but it'll also increase the price level in the economy. And that will satisfy the increase in the quantity of money demanded. The fact that there's more money there means that there's more demand for goods and services, and that means that people will want to hold, will push the prices up, and that means because the prices are higher, people will want to hold more money just to buy the things that they need, and that gives you the new equilibrium, hopefully. Now, in classical economics, there's something that's called the classical dichotomy. Dichotomy means like two worlds. And really what these two worlds were, as far as the classical economists were concerned, was the nominal world, and that's the one we live in, where everything is priced in dollars. The dollars that we see, when we go to the grocery store, when we go to the movie theater, when we go and buy anything. And then the real economy. The real economy is really how much each dollar that we have buys. So it's all about, what our real wage is, what the real interest rate is, what our real income is. So that's the classical dichotomy. Now, let's ask this question then. What should we consider? Should we consider, if we're economists, should we consider nominal variables or real variables? Well, the answer is that, of course, we should consider real variables. And that's the answer. Why? Because when you think back to the chapter that we did on national income accounting, you know that, how we really measure how the economy grows is through our measure of real GDP. In other words, the amount of goods and services that we produce. That's what's important. So, as economists, although we live in a world where everything is priced in nominal terms, in dollars, what we're really interested in is, not how much you get in terms of your salary, but what that salary can buy. I'll give you an example of that. Suppose that all prices in the economy double tomorrow. So that means everything's gone up by 100%. If your salary goes up by 50%, you might think, yay, I've got more money, I'm earning 50% more. But really, okay, you are in nominal terms earning 50% more. But in real terms, you're not. You're earning less than you were before. Why? Because each dollar that you earn can buy less than it did before. So you can see, really, we should always be looking at things in terms of real variables, not nominal variables. And that's because prices, of course, determine how much we can get of each good or service. So, when we have changes in the money supply, of course, that influences nominal variables. As we've seen, it influences prices. But it's really irrelevant, in a way, for explaining what happens in real terms. And in economics, we have, and this came once again from the actual new classical school of economics, we have a proposition called monetary neutrality. And it's not on this slide, but it should be the monetary neutrality proposition, if you want to note that in your notes. And the idea here is that if we do have an increase in the money supply, if everyone knows about it, then what are they going to do? Well, let's go back to my example. If the money supply doubles, we know that prices are going to double. What are we all going to do in terms of our salary increases? We're all going to ask for a doubling of our salaries, right? If we don't, we're going to lose out in real terms. So, if the money supply doubles, then prices double, then we're all going to ask for more in real terms. The same in real terms, at least. Or maybe we might ask for more. But we're going to at least ask for the same increase that prices have gone up by. If that's the case, and economists think that that is the case in the long run, so over a number of years, then we have what we call monetary neutrality. In other words, changes in money supply and prices don't affect real variables. Now, as I said, in the long run, that's what we assume, or what we think. But of course, that's not completely realistic in the short run. In the short run, things change at different rates. So the dynamics of how the economy moves from one equilibrium to another equilibrium is going to be different, in the sense that in the short run, we can have an economy that's not monetary neutral. It doesn't hold, the monetary neutrality proposition doesn't hold, but it should hold in the long run. Now, what we're going to now do is introduce the quantity equation, which is the way in which economists, classical economists, thought this up originally, look at money and its effect on output, the production of real goods and services. And to begin our analysis, we define something called the velocity of money. The velocity of money is how rapidly a dollar bill changes hands. And we can define that really as how much expenditure there is relative to the stock of money. So in other words, how much spending is going on in the economy financed by the amount of dollars that there are in the economy. So in other words, how much spending should represent how many times that money stock, that monetary aggregate, has to change hands to fund or to equal the amount of spending there is in the economy. So if we take nominal GDP, so we can take real GDP, multiply that by prices. If you remember, to get real GDP, you take nominal and divide by prices. So you could, on the top of that equation, halfway down the PowerPoint, say nominal GDP divided by money. But another way of expressing that is real GDP times prices, which is of course nominal GDP, divided by the amount of money in the economy, tells you how fast each dollar has to go around the economy to fund the amount of nominal output, the amount of nominal GDP. We can rearrange that and we get something that's called the equation of exchange. What it tells us is how many times the money stock has to go around the economy to fund nominal GDP. So it's M, the amount of money, times V, how fast it has to go around or change hands in the economy, equals the amount of spending in the economy, which is nominal GDP, which can be split down into prices times real GDP. So MV equals PY is the equation. Now, once we got the quantity equation, the quantity theory, so this isn't kind of emphasized on this slide, but the quantity of theory says, okay, you have an increase in money that's got to be reflected in one of the other three variables. In other words, if M goes up, P stays the same, Y stays the same, then V must go down. So velocity of money must fall. Or if M goes up, V stays constant, Y stays constant, then prices must go up. So if money supply goes up, in this case, if V and Y are fixed, prices go up. So you're going to get inflation. The last possibility, of course, is if V is constant and P is constant, then if M goes up, real output goes up, Y goes up. So it must be reflected in, if this holds, and most economists believe that it does hold, then an increase in M must be reflected in one of those three possibilities. So the next question to ask is, which is the most realistic of those possibilities? You know, which is most probable out of those three possibilities? Well, here's some evidence, by the way, first of all, for the quantity equation. So you have nominal GDP, you know, that's P times Y in that equation we just saw. And there's M2, which is a measure of money supply, as you all know. And there's also velocity. So there's Y, P times Y, in brown. Velocity is the line at the bottom of the chart, which is in blue, which doesn't seem to change. And M2 seems to also increase roughly in line with nominal GDP. So it gives us an answer. V stays roughly constant. So as M goes up, P times Y goes up. V doesn't go down, in other words. So that's got rid of one of the possibilities. So that's number one there, velocity of money is relatively stable over time. So if we do get a change in the money supply, we seem to get a proportionate change in the nominal value of output. In other words, nominal GDP increases roughly in the same proportion. What about Y? Well, Y is dependent on the amount of factors of production that we have. We know that from the production possibility curve, and also on technology in the economy. So money, on the whole, by the way, I disagree with that last statement there. On the whole, it doesn't affect output. And of course, the other possibility is change in money supply M induces proportional changes in the price level rather than Y. So that's the one that the classical economists focused on, and that is the so-called quantity theory of money. So in other words, if you get an increase in money supply, the quantity theory says as long as Y is relatively constant and V is relatively constant, there is only one place it can show up, in price level. So if money supply accelerates, and of course it has done lately, then that could lead to a high rate of inflation in the long run, and that's of current concern. Now, how can we see this, in practice? Well, one way of seeing this is to look at very extreme inflation, so hyperinflation. That's inflation that exceeds 50% a month. There, when money supply is increased, it's always increased by over 50% a month. And if that's per month, then obviously you're going to get a 100-fold increase in prices over the course of a year. And when we look at this hyperinflation data, and there's a famous paper that looked at this back in the 1950s, there's a clear link between the quantity of money and the price level. And we just have to look at, say, for instance, the 4 classic hyperinflation episodes that occurred back in the 1920s. This is between the First World War and the Second World War. Why did it happen? Well, it happened because when we finished the First World War, when we won the First World War, we insisted that the losing side, that was Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Poland, pay back the West for the amount of damage that had been done. And they just could not afford it, and their economies were also in a mess. So they just printed money. And as they printed money, of course, they got very, very rapid inflation. And, when too much money is printed, then basically you get that as being the result. So here's some very interesting evidence. Here are the 4 hyperinflations that happened between the wars. So from 1921 through to 1924, you can see the money supply went up by 10,000 times in Austria. Sorry about that. Went up 10,000 times in Austria, and the price level went up by almost the same amount. What does that tell you? It tells you that increases in M don't feed through to reductions in V or increases in Y. They feed through to increases in the price level, certainly at inflation rates of this size. You can see Hungary's. There, price levels went up by more than 10,000, about 50,000 times, and that was once again due to money supply increasing. Germany was probably one of the worst. You can see when, in 1923, the latter part of 1923. And there, the money supply was increased compared to where it was in 1921. 3 years later, it was, 1 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion times the amount that it was in 1921. And look, you can see the price level went up to over that, so over 1 trillion times higher. And last one is Poland. Less dramatic, but still same result. Are there any recent hyperinflations, you might ask? Well, hyperinflation is not a thing of the past. Argentina and Brazil had it in the 1980s. Russia had it also in the 1990s. And many CEECs, that's Central and Eastern European countries. So countries like Poland, Czech Republic for a time, etc. In the 1990s, and even in the 2000s, we've had hyperinflation. Zimbabwe is the most recent country. I have a 1 billion Zimbabwe dollar note on my wall in my office. So, the answer to the next question is, well, if you have hyperinflation, how do you stop it? Well, you should be able to tell me the answer by now. If you can't, then you haven't been listening. The answer is, stop printing money. Very, very simple. So now, if we do have inflation, let's think about what the effects of inflation are. One of the things which economists talk about, which a lot of people fail to understand, is that inflation imposes a tax on people. And we call it an inflation tax. Very simple. It's the revenue that the government raises by creating money, by printing money. And if you think about it, if you hold money and the prices are increasing, each dollar that you hold is worth less. We've already stated that. In a way, that's a tax on the money that you're holding. You can think about it that way. So that's where the idea of an inflation tax comes from. We've already talked about the principle of monetary neutrality. That is, it doesn't affect real variables in the long run. Now, how might that be the case with interest rates, for instance? We talked about it in the case of, real income, real wages. How about interest rates? Well, what's the equation for the real interest rate? If you remember, I think we did this before. It's the nominal interest rate minus inflation, which gives you the real interest rate. We can rearrange that equation, though, and make the nominal interest rate the subject of the equation, in which case we get that the real interest rate plus the inflation rate, because we move the inflation rate to the left-hand side in that second bullet point, equals the nominal interest rate. In other words, the nominal interest rate really can be considered to consist of two components. One, the actual real return that anyone gets who lends money out, and also compensation for inflation. So in other words, the inflation rate. And the Fisher effect is an effect thought up by a US economist called Irving Fisher in the early 1900s. What he said is if you get a 1% increase in inflation, surely, given the equation we had on the previous page, so this equation at the bottom here, if inflation rate goes up, real interest rate stays the same, then that should lead for a 1-for-1 increase in the nominal interest rate. So that was his theory, which is now called an effect. So when the Fed increases the rate of money growth, if it leads to inflation, or a higher inflation rate, that should lead to a higher nominal interest rate if the Fisher effect works. So let's look at the evidence. Well, the evidence is, as you see, quite strong. Here's the nominal interest rate. There's inflation. They do tend to, certainly for certain periods, if you look at the 1970s, they do tend to follow each other. In fact, inflation in the 1970s was above the nominal interest rate. What does that mean? It means the real interest rate was exactly negative. Negative interest rates are not something that we usually think about, but in this case, during the 1970s, and in fact recently as well, as recently as 2009, we had negative real interest rates as well in this country. So in other words, the Fisher effect doesn't hold perfectly, but it does hold to a certain degree. All right, let's look at the costs of inflation now. If they impose a burden, we've already talked about inflation tax. What else can we add to this list of things why we might not want inflation? Well, inflation, as we know, robs people of the purchasing power of their hard-earned dollars. I mean, that's the inflation tax. But that might be considered a fallacy. Why? Because if we get more dollars when inflation goes up, in other words, if everyone earns more, then they're going to be willing to spend more. So in other words, if inflation's gone up, prices have doubled, and you doubled your salary, then you just have to accept the fact that you're going to spend twice as much, right? So when prices rise, buyers would pay more and sellers would get more. So inflation doesn't, in and of itself, reduce people's real purchasing power if they adjust for that inflation. Of course, if they don't adjust for the inflation, then it will reduce their purchasing power. We've already established that. But there are also other costs. The first of these is so-called shoe leather costs. Shoe leather meaning the fact that you have to walk around a lot when inflation is higher. What does that mean? Well, probably in Texas we drive around more looking for the cheaper price because, when you have inflation, of course, rising prices, it encourages people to reduce their money holdings. So in other words, they don't want to hold a lot of money. Think about this in hyperinflation terms. If you have very high inflation, are you going to go to the bank and get money out for the week? No, because in 1 week, inflation will have gone up, considerably, or the prices will have gone up considerably. So the value of what you took out at the beginning of the week is going to be a lot less already. So in countries with hyperinflation, people go to the bank really regularly. And people, of course, if they have money in the bank and they can't get an interest rate to cover their the loss or to cover inflation, they will suffer a loss in their real money balances, in their real checking accounts, real value of their checking accounts. So in hyperinflation countries, if you are poor, you rush around trying to find something that will hold value. And in a lot of hyperinflation countries, that means buying durable goods, in fact. So in countries like Brazil, when they suffered hyperinflation, people would rush out with their money and buy food, frozen food typically, to make sure they could get through the month. And they would buy things that they knew would hold their value pretty well, often durable goods. The second type of cost of inflation is menu costs. When you have prices rising, then restaurants and companies that have catalogs, etc., and price lists, they're going to have to change those prices on a frequent basis. Now, you think about a supermarket. All the prices are there. It costs money in terms of hiring someone to go and change those prices. The more frequently you have to change them, the more people you've got to have doing that work. So it means that there's basically increased costs of inflation because of that reason. By the way, menu costs was something that Greg Mankiw came up with a paper in the 1990s. So this is his baby, this idea of menu costs. Another problem as well with inflation is that when you have higher inflation, certain prices tend to go up much faster than other prices. So we know that relative prices allocate scarce resources. So, if we're going to have prices that go up at different rates, and they do go up at very different rates, usually when you have hyperinflation, it means that consumer decisions are going to get distorted. That's a problem. And markets are less able to allocate resources to their best use. In other words, producers are more worried about making sure that they cover price increases. So what happens? Why is this the case, you might ask? Well, certain producers, when they see high inflation, they're worried about covering their costs, particularly if they're in a low margin industry, an industry where the profit is very slim. They don't want to get caught out. So often they tend to increase their prices much more rapidly. So there's higher inflation in those things where there's low margins, and that means that there's different inflation rates. Now, there's other problems with inflation as well, and that's to do with the tax system. We've looked at the tax system already. We know that taxes distort incentives, but when we have inflation, there's even more problems. One very good example of that is so-called capital gains. When you make money on anything, say a house, or on stocks or shares, or on bonds, then you are taxed on those gains. So if you sell an asset for more than its purchase price, then you're taxed on that. The same thing goes for profits as well for companies. And inflation, basically is going to push up a lot of the value anyway of stocks and things like that. So automatically you're going to get taxed on that. So that's an increased cost that you have to bear when you hold stocks and bonds in a high inflation environment. Inflation also discourages saving. Why? Because if you put money away, you've got high inflation, unless you're getting an interest rate that covers you for the inflation. In other words, you're getting a positive real interest rate, then it's not going to encourage you to save. Also, as I've already mentioned, with the capital gains, the size of those capital gains is going to go up. So if you stick it in a stock, as I said, then if there's inflation, then the stock price is probably likely to rise faster, so it means you owe more taxes. So it increases your tax burden. Here we talk about the tax treatment of interest income. And once again, what are we taxed on? We're taxed on the nominal interest that we earn on savings. So even though part of the nominal interest rate compensates for inflation, we're still going to be taxed on that income. And if that income is increased because nominal interest rates go up, then we're going to have to owe more taxes on that. So that tends to discourage people from saving. I think I already explained that, but in any case, here we go again. So here's an example of this. Let's take two real interest rates that are the same in two different economies. One is an economy with high inflation, that's economy B, and it's got an inflation rate of 8%. And economy A has an inflation rate of 0%. So the nominal interest rate, if we know those inflation rates, we can add those together. And we know that the nominal interest rate must be 4% in economy A and 12% in economy B. So let's say there's a 25% tax and it's on nominal interest rate. Well, that means you take a 1% deduction really in the interest that you get in economy A, because that's 25% of 4 is 1. 25% of 12 would be 3. So you subtract that off and you get your after-tax nominal interest rate, really what you're earning, which is 3% in economy A and 9% in economy B. Well, now let's subtract the inflation rate, because that's really what you're earning is the real interest rate. So 3 is a nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate 0 gives you 3% for the after-tax real interest rate in economy A. In economy B, it's 9% minus the inflation rate, which is 8%, which is only 1% real return. So in a higher inflation economy, with the same tax rate, you're actually only getting back 1%, whereas in an economy with 0 inflation, you get back 3%. So it discourages saving. So that's really a way of showing that previous statement. Now, let's talk a bit about money and its relationship to the Federal Reserve. So the Fed's job is to ensure the reliability of money and ensure the value of money, really. And if you look at the Federal Reserve Act, it says that the Fed's job is to ensure the internal and external value of the dollar. Internal meaning making sure that inflation isn't too high. External means the exchange rate, of course. Now, when the Fed therefore increases the money supply, we know it's going to create inflation, and it'll erode the real value of money. particularly when we have unexpected inflation. Why? Well, as I've said before, if we have expected inflation, if we know the Fed has increased money supply, then we know that inflation is coming, then we know to ask for a higher salary to cover us for that inflation that's coming. And therefore, there shouldn't be any effect on our real salary. The problem comes when we don't know that. So that's unexpected inflation, when we're not sure what's going on. And unexpected inflation among the population is going to redistribute wealth, not by merit, not by need. It's going to redistribute wealth among debtors and creditors. And how is it going to do that? Well, think about this. If you borrow money from a bank, and the bank assumes that inflation is going to be 3%, and they want a real return of 3% as well, they're going to charge you 6%. That gives them a real return of 3%, and each dollar they're going to get back from you in a year's time is going to be worth 3% less because of inflation. Each dollar will buy 3% less goods and services. So if inflation's higher than they expect, so it turns out to be 6% rather than 3%, what's their real return? Well, it's 0. So in other words, those that lend when you have unexpected inflation are going to suffer. Those that borrow, of course, won't suffer. They'll gain. Why? Because the 6%, when they pay the interest at the end of the year, the dollars that they're paying are worth 6% less in any case. So effectively, they've had a 0% real rate of interest. So that's how unexpected inflation redistributes wealth. Now, inflation, of course, is not something that's certain in any case. It's volatile and uncertain. But what we do know, and there's been quite a lot of research on this, is when inflation is high, it's a lot more variable. It's a lot more volatile. So there's a bigger variation when it's high. So there's actually more uncertainty with higher levels of inflation. There's more certainty with lower rates of inflation, and that's why the Fed tries to keep inflation low. It doesn't want high levels of inflation. Now, what about deflation? We haven't really covered that, but deflation is something that we've experienced lately in the end of 2009, as you know, and Japan's been experiencing for perhaps the last nearly 20 years now. Now, a small amount of deflation may be desirable, but Milton Friedman, who's he's what they call a monetarist. He's an economist. He's now died recently. He won the Nobel Prize for his work on money demand and money supply. A lot of the stuff you did today was also he had a hand in developing. But Milton Friedman came up with this Friedman rule. What he said is that moderate deflation will lower the nominal interest rate. Now, why is that? Well, because remember, the nominal interest rate, you just have to turn that equation for the real interest rate round, as we did before. The nominal interest rate is equal to inflation plus the real interest rate. So if you get negative inflation, you add that to the real interest rate, it's going to lead to a nominal interest rate that's lower than the real interest rate. Let me give you an example. If you have minus 1% inflation, that's deflation, plus say 3% real rate of return, 3 plus minus 1 is 2%. So you're going to have a lower nominal interest rate. It's going to reduce the cost of holding money. Why? Well, think about it. When you've got deflation, it means prices are not increasing, but they're falling. So M over P, what's happening to M over P? Well, fix M for the moment, divide it by P, and let P go down. That means M over P is actually going to go up. So it means that each dollar will be worth more. So it means that the value of a dollar will increase over time. So you're going to also get lower shoe leather costs of holding money. Why? Because you don't have to find where the cheapest deal is. If you've got very low inflation, you've got a normal interest rate that's close to zero, then prices should be falling slightly, and that means that you don't have shoe leather costs. In other words, you're not wandering around trying to get the best deal because prices are increasing quite rapidly. So deflation may actually be worse because with cost of deflation, there's also menu costs, changing prices, also the relative price variability that we see with inflation. If it's not steady and predictable, just like when you have inflation, if inflation comes down and you've taken a loan, essentially your real interest rate has gone up. It means you're transferring more wealth than was originally intended with the inflation rate you thought was going to occur. So when you have bigger deflation than you thought, you're transferring money back to the person you borrowed from, and that money, each dollar, is worth more because of deflation. It can buy more goods and services. So it means there's a redistribution of wealth towards the people who lend and away from the people who borrow when you have deflation. Now, the main key point, though, is that with deflation in the whole economy, in the whole macroeconomy, it arises usually because of much broader macroeconomic problems. If all prices are falling in the economy, it means there's not enough demand for all the goods and services. So it could be a symptom of much deeper economic problems than is first apparent. That's why, by the way, the Fed really tries to avoid any thought of deflation, and why Japan's economy has been such a mess over the past nearly 18 to 20 years because of deflation in the Japanese case. Now we end this chapter with a discussion of the movie The Wizard of Oz. It's based on a children's book written in 1900, and it's an allegory, which most people don't know, about US monetary policy in the late 19th century. Between 1880 and 1896, the price level in the US fell by 23%, so there was big-time deflation. And there was a major redistribution of wealth, as I just talked about, and the farmers in the West were the debtors and the bankers in the East were the creditors. So the farmers in the West found that when they took loans, because people weren't expecting deflation, that when they paid back those dollars, in fact, those dollars were worth more than the ones they borrowed originally. So in other words, their interest rate was much higher in real terms than when they took the loan. So the real value of debts increased. And the solution that was proposed at the time was free coinage of silver. So in other words, going to a silver money. And it was during the gold standard that this was suggested. Basically, the quantity of gold was determined by the money supply. There was only a certain amount of gold actually available at that time in the US. So it was relatively fixed, and the price level was relatively fixed. So the free silver advocates advocated silver to be used as money, and that would increase the money supply and push up the price level, they hoped, and therefore reduce the real burden of the farmers' debts, because we know when inflation goes up, in fact, each dollar that you pay back if you borrow is worth less, not more. So that means that in fact your real interest rate comes down. And the author of the book was L. Frank Baum. He was a Midwestern journalist, and the characters are based on protagonists in the major political battle of the time over silver. And the characters are Dorothy, as you probably know. She was supposed to hold traditional American values. Toto represented the Prohibitionist Party, also called the Teetotalers. Scarecrows were the farmers. The Tin Woodsmen were the industrial workers. The Cowardly Lion was William Jennings Bryan, who suggested the silver standard at the time. The Munchkins were the citizens of the East, and the Wicked Witch of the East was Grover Cleveland. He was the president at the time. He was president twice, and he's the only president, I believe, to have 2 non-consecutive terms. And he was against using silver. The Wicked Witch of the West was William McKinley. He was also president during that period. And the Wizard was Marcus Alonzo Hanna, chairman of the Republican Party at the time, who was one of the proponents of the silver standard. By the way, William McKinley was a Democrat against the silver standard. So Oz, the Wizard of Oz, ounce, of course, is an abbreviation for an ounce of silver or an ounce of gold. And the yellow brick road was the gold standard at the time. So Dorothy finds her way home not just by following the yellow brick road, not just by having a gold standard, but also the magical power of her silver slippers. And there's no coincidence that silver was chosen because of the idea of having silver as a money. So in other words, using the gold standard for the larger coins, but also allowing silver to circulate in terms of silver coins. That would increase the amount of money in the economy, they thought, and therefore that would increase the price level, and that would get the US out of the deflationary problem. So the idea was basically the whole basis for The Wizard of Oz, the famous movie. In fact, the populace got the monetary expansion and inflation they wanted, and it was through an accident of fate. It was because of the new discoveries of gold in the Klondike River in the Canadian Yukon and California as well. And also there was lots more gold found in South Africa. So suddenly the amount of gold increased in North America as well. So the money supply and the price level eventually started to rise. So that cured the problem of deflation.